Welcome to Velvet Chronicles, where every secret changes destiny. Tonight's story begins. Marriages among the nobility aren't forged in heaven. They are negotiated in drawing rooms, weighed in acres, and paid for in bloodlines. When the Duke of Ravensmoor came looking for a wife, Lord Edmund Halloway polished his two brightest daughters like prize fillies at a country auction. He paraded their wit, their immaculate posture, their impeccable breeding. Nobody looked at the youngest girl standing in the corner, quietly pouring the tea. But a man drowning in noise doesn't want a songbird. He wants peace. The rain had been falling for 3 days, turning the carriage drives of Cumbria into thick, sucking bogs. Lord Edmund Halloway did not care. He stood by the tall, draughty windows of the morning room, his breath fogging the glass, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles bled white. "He's coming," Edmund said. The words dropped like stones into the quiet room. Behind him, the Halloway sisters arranged themselves. It was an exercise in calculated casualness. Serafina, the eldest by 3 years, sat nearest the hearth. The firelight caught the gold threads woven through her dark hair. She held a piece of needlepoint she hadn't actually worked on in a month. It was a prop. Serafina understood the mechanics of this afternoon better than anyone. At 24, she was staring down the barrel of spinsterhood. But she was beautiful, sharp, striking, and ambitious enough to choke a horse. "Is his carriage crest visible?" Serafina asked. She didn't look up. She kept her voice entirely level. "Mud," Edmund snapped. "Covered in mud. But it is a crest. 6 horses. Only a duke drives 6 through this slop." On the velvet settee, Isolde turned a page of her book, French Poetry, Rousseau. She didn't speak French particularly well, but the volume looked good in her lap. Isolde was the middle child. If Serafina was the beauty, Isolde was the wit. She was the one who could quote parliamentary debates, the one who played the pianoforte with an aggressive mathematical precision. "Do calm down, father," Isolde murmured, moistening her thumb to turn another page. "If you sweat through your collar before his grace even crosses the threshold, he will think we are desperate." "We are desperate," Edmund snarled, turning from the window. "The roof in the west wing is rotting. The tenants are holding back rent. If one of you doesn't secure a settlement by Michaelmas, we will be eating the horses." Wren stood by the sideboard. She didn't say anything. She rarely did when the air in the room got this thick. Wren was 20. She possessed neither Serafina's arresting profile nor Isolde's biting intellect. She was small, pale, and entirely unremarkable. Her dress was a muted grey, not by choice, but because the dressmaker's fabric had run out after outfitting her sisters, leaving only the duller cuts for the youngest. She was currently organizing the tea service, heavy silver, delicate porcelain cups painted with fading blue swallows. She wiped a smudge off a saucer with her thumb. The heavy oak front doors groaned open in the hall beneath them. The sound of boots on the marble floor echoed up the stairs. "Positions," Edmund hissed. He hastily ran a hand over his thinning hair and marched out into the hall to intercept his salvation. Wren moved a step back, melting into the shadows beside the heavy velvet curtains. She watched her sisters. Serafina pinched her cheeks hard, leaving 2 blooming red marks that perfectly simulated a youthful flush. Isolde snapped her book shut, leaving a finger in the pages to look interrupted. Footsteps approached. Then the Duke of Ravensmoor entered the room. Gareth Ashworth did not look like a man who owned half of Northumberland. He looked tired. He was 31, tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead. His heavy riding coat dripped water onto the Halloway's threadbare Persian rug. He didn't carry a cane. He didn't wear a top hat. He looked like a man who had ridden the last 5 miles on horseback rather than sit in a stuffy carriage, and his boots were caked in grey mud. There was a faint scar pulling at the corner of his left eye, a souvenir from the peninsula. He had inherited the title a year ago when his elder brother broke his neck in a hunting accident. Gareth hadn't been raised to rule a duchy. He had been raised to be a soldier. He stood in the doorway, his grey eyes sweeping the room. It was not a look of romantic appraisal. It was a tactical assessment. "Your Grace," Edmund boomed, practically vibrating with eager anxiety. "Welcome to Raythorn. May I present my daughters?" Seraphina stood first. The rustle of her silk skirt was loud in the quiet room. She dropped into a flawless curtsy, the angle of her neck, the dip of her shoulders engineered to show off her collarbones. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a purr of polite concern. "You must be terribly cold. The roads are wretched this time of year." "They are mud," Gareth said. His voice was deep, scraping the bottom of his throat. He did not smile. "I apologize for tracking it into your home." "Think nothing of it," Edmund laughed loudly, too loudly. "We are honored." "Honored. And this is my second daughter, Isolde." Isolde rose, keeping her finger in her book. She offered a smaller, more intellectual curtsy. "An honor, Your Grace. I was just reading about the agricultural reforms in the northern counties. I understand your estates have implemented the new crop rotations." It was a bold move. Too bold, Wren thought from the corner. Gareth blinked. He looked at Isolde, then at the book in her hand. "The stewards manage the rotation, Miss Isolde. I mostly concern myself with the ledgers." The rejection of her intellectual bait was flat and immediate. Isolde's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before cementing back into place. "And the youngest," Edmund said, waving a dismissive hand toward the sideboard. "Wren." Gareth looked past the glowing hearth, past the striking Seraphina and the ambitious Isolde. He looked into the shadows. Wren didn't step forward. She didn't curtsy deeply. She merely inclined her head, her hand still resting flat against the cool mahogany of the sideboard. "Your Grace," she said softly. He held her gaze for a second. Nothing registered on his face. He nodded once, then turned back to Lord Halloway. "I appreciate your hospitality, Lord Halloway," Gareth said, unbuttoning his heavy, wet coat. A footman scuttled forward to take it. "I will only stay an hour. I have business in London by tomorrow evening." "An hour?" The panic spiked in Edmund's chest. "An hour to sell a daughter." Of course," Edmund babbled. "Please sit by the fire. Warm yourself. Girls, entertain his grace." Gareth sank into the wingback chair. It creaked under his weight. His joints ached. The damp of the English countryside always made the old wound in his thigh throb. He stared at the flames licking the soot-stained bricks of the hearth. He hated this. He hated the season. He hated the ballrooms. And most of all, he hated these private viewings. He knew exactly why he was here. He needed an heir. He needed a wife. His terrifying mother had handed him a list of acceptable candidates. The Halloway girls were on it. Good bloodlines, bankrupt father. It meant they would be eager, compliant, and cheap to acquire. He wouldn't have to deal with demanding in-laws. He could pay off Lord Halloway's debts, take a wife back to Blackmoor, shut the door, and be left alone. "May I offer you some wine, Your Grace?" Seraphina asked, hovering at his elbow. Her perfume was overwhelming, lavender and heavy musk. It smelled like a crowded London ballroom. It made his headache worse. "Tea, if you have it," Gareth said, not looking at her. "I have a long ride ahead." Of course, Seraphina beamed. She snapped her fingers at her younger sister. "Wren, tea for the Duke." She didn't look at Wren when she commanded her. It was a reflex, Gareth noticed. He didn't say anything, but his eyes tracked the sharp, dismissive snap of Seraphina's fingers. "Tell me, Your Grace," Seraphina continued, sinking gracefully onto the sofa opposite him, leaning forward just enough, "do you plan to spend the winter in London or at your country estate?" "I have always preferred the country. London is so exhausting." It was a lie. Gareth could smell it. Women like Seraphina lived for the social season. If he locked her in Blackmoor for the winter, she would go mad and take him down with her. Blackmoor, he answered flatly. It is quiet. I adore the quiet, Seraphina said smoothly. Do you? Isolde interjected, moving to the pianoforte. You complained just yesterday that the lack of callers was driving you to madness, sister. A flash of pure venom crossed Seraphina's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Isolde sat at the bench, arranging her skirts. Perhaps some music, your grace. The weather is so dismal, a little melody might chase the damp away. If you wish, Gareth said. He rubbed 2 fingers against his temple. Isolde didn't play a gentle parlor song. She played a complex, frantic sonata. Her fingers pounded the keys, showcasing her rigorous training, her discipline, her absolute mastery of the instrument. It was loud. In the closed, humid air of the morning room, the notes bounced off the plaster walls and hammered into Gareth's skull. He closed his eyes. The tension in his jaw clamped down. He was a man who had spent for years listening to cannon fire and the screams of dying men in muddy trenches. He didn't want aggressive mastery. He wanted silence. Lord Holloway stood by the mantel, beaming with pride, oblivious to the way the Duke's knuckles were turning white where he gripped the arms of the chair. Splendid, isn't she? Edmund shouted over the crashing chords. Taught by a master from Vienna. Gareth gave a tight, mechanical nod. He wanted to leave. He looked at the clock on the mantel. 50 minutes left. He could endure 50 minutes. Through the deafening barrage of the sonata, a faint clink of porcelain sounded. Gareth opened his eyes. The youngest girl, Wren, was standing at the small table beside his chair. He hadn't heard her approach. She moved with a strange, liquid silence, stepping lightly on the creaking floorboards. She held a cup and saucer. Wren had watched him since he walked in. She saw the way he favored his left leg. She saw the dark, bruised exhaustion under his eyes. She watched Seraphina suffocate him with perfume and platitudes. She watched Isolde assault him with Beethoven. He was an animal caught in a trap, too polite to chew off his own leg to escape. Wren knew about traps. She had lived in one her entire life. When your sole purpose in a family is to be the background against which your sisters shine, you learn to observe. You learn to read the room. She had prepared the tea. The silver pot was heavy, hot against the cotton of her gloves. The Halloways always served tea with heavy cream and mounds of crystallized sugar, a pathetic attempt to show wealth they didn't possess. But looking at the hard, weathered lines of the Duke's face, Wren bypassed the sugar bowl. A man who rides through a storm, who looks at a fire with such weary resentment, doesn't want sweet things. She poured the tea dark, a deep, robust amber. No milk, no sugar. She carried it to him while Isolde struck a particularly violent chord. Wren didn't interrupt. She didn't offer a smile or ask if he preferred it weak or strong. She didn't ask for his attention at all. She simply lowered the cup and saucer onto the small wooden table at his right elbow. The porcelain made a tiny clink as she set it down. Gareth looked at the cup. Dark tea, steam rising in a thin, straight ribbon. He looked up at her. Wren was standing close enough that he could smell her. She didn't smell like lavender or musk. She smelled like starch, clean cotton, and a faint trace of rain-soaked earth. It was a grounded smell. No sugar, he asked. His voice was low under the noise of the piano. Wren met his gaze. Her eyes were a strange pale hazel, caught somewhere between green and gold. They were the most startling thing about her. You do not strike me as a man who coats a bitter thing in sugar to pretend it is sweet, Your Grace, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, uninflected. There was no flirtation in it, no desperation. It was simply a statement of fact. Gareth stared at her. The hammering of the pianoforte seemed to recede, dropping away into white noise. He reached out and picked up the cup. His fingers brushed against hers as she pulled her hand away. Her skin was warm. He brought the rim to his lips and drank. The tea was strong, astringent. It burned pleasantly down his throat, cutting through the damp chill that had settled in his bones. "It is exactly right," he said. Wren gave a bare fraction of a nod. "I'm glad." She didn't linger. She didn't use the opening to launch into a monologue about her hobbies. She simply turned and walked back to the shadows by the sideboard, leaving him with his perfect cup of tea. Gareth watched her go. He took another slow sip. At the pianoforte, Isolde struck the final chord, letting it ring out with theatrical triumph. She turned on the bench, chest heaving slightly, a victorious smile pinned to her face. "Beautifully played, Isolde," Serafina said, though her voice dripped with acid. She turned to the Duke. "Don't you agree, Your Grace?" Gareth placed the teacup back on the saucer. "I am afraid I lack the ear for it," he said plainly. Isolde's smile cracked. "But surely," Lord Halloway interjected, stepping forward, desperate to regain control of the room, "surely you appreciate a woman of accomplishments. A duchess must host, after all. She must entertain." Gareth looked at the father, the sweating, frantic man. He looked at the two older sisters, leaning forward like hounds at a fox hunt. "I have no interest in entertaining," Gareth said. The room went dead silent. Only the rain lashing against the windows made a sound. "My life in Blackmoor is entirely devoid of society. My estate is remote. The house is old, and it is draughty. I do not host balls. I do not attend Parliament unless dragged by the king himself. A woman seeking accomplishments and admiration would perish of boredom within a month." Serafina's jaw tightened. The prospect of being buried alive in the country without a season was horrifying to her. But he was a duke. She forced a laugh. "You exaggerate your isolation, surely." "I assure you, Miss Halloway, I do not." Gareth stood up. The hour was not over. But he had seen enough. He had made his decision. Edmund's face flushed a deep, panic purple. "Your Grace, please. You have only just arrived." "You haven't. I have seen all I need to see, Lord Halloway." Gareth turned to face the room. He didn't look at Serafina. He didn't look at Isolde. He looked across the room, past the silver tea service, to the girl in the grey dress standing quietly against the wall. "Miss Wren," Gareth called out. The entire room pivoted. Serafina's head snapped around. Isolde stood up from the piano bench. Wren blinked, stepping slightly out of the shadows. "Yes, Your Grace." "Do you play the pianoforte?" he asked. "No, Your Grace. I have no ear for music." "Do you enjoy London society?" "I have never been to London." "I imagine it is loud." Gareth's chest moved in what might have been a silent laugh. The tight lines around his eyes relaxed marginally. "It is," he agreed. He took a step toward her. The heavy thud of his boots on the floorboards drew a line of tension through the room. "And if you were entirely isolated in a draughty house in the north, with no callers and no balls, how would you spend your days?" Lord Halloway let out a strangled, objecting noise. "Your Grace, Wren she is merely the youngest. She is not out yet. She is not prepared." "I am speaking to her, Lord Halloway," Gareth cut him off, his voice carrying the crack of a commanding officer. The father snapped his mouth shut. Gareth stopped 3 feet from Wren. He looked down at her. "Well?" Wren didn't flinch under the weight of his stare. She looked back at him, her pale eyes steady. She thought about his muddy boots. She thought about the way he gripped the chair when the music was too loud. She thought about a quiet, draughty house in the country. "I would walk the hills," Wren said. "I would read in silence, and I would ensure the tea was brewed properly." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the Halloway morning room. Serafina was staring at her younger sister as if she had just grown a second head. Isolde's face was pale with outrage. Gareth Ashworth held Wren's gaze for a long time. The transaction of the marriage mart vanished. For a fleeting second, it was just two quiet people recognizing each other in a loud, crowded room. "Lord Holloway," Gareth said, not breaking eye contact with Wren. "Yes, Your Grace," Edmund stammered behind him. "I will speak with you in your study regarding the settlements." Gareth finally looked away from Wren, turning his massive frame toward the door. "I require no further introductions. I have found my Duchess." The door to the study closed with a heavy, final thud. Lord Edmund Holloway scrambled to the mahogany desk, his hand shaking as he gestured to a leather armchair. Gareth did not sit. He remained standing by the unlit hearth, his massive frame dwarfing the room. "Brandy, Your Grace," Edmund offered, his voice a pitch too high. "Ink," Gareth replied, "and paper." Edmund swallowed the rest of his eager hospitality. He hurriedly pulled a fresh sheet of parchment from a drawer and set a brass inkwell beside it. He hovered, a man waiting for a guillotine to drop or a shower of gold to fall. He wasn't sure which it would be. Gareth stepped to the desk. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was a soldier. He dealt in logistics. "I will clear the debts tied to this estate," Gareth said, his voice flat. "Your creditors in London will be paid by Friday. I will establish an allowance of £800 a year for the maintenance of Raythorn, paid quarterly." Edmund's eyes widened. £800. It was more than he had dared hope for. It was salvation. He opened his mouth to pour out a fountain of gratitude, but Gareth raised a single scarred hand. "There are conditions." The Duke continued, leaning his knuckles on the desk, bringing his face closer to Edmund's. His grey eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "First, you will use a portion of that allowance to fix the roof of the West Wing. If I hear your tenants are still living in damp rot by next winter, I will cut the funds entirely." "Yes, absolutely, Your Grace." "The roof, of course." "Second, my marriage to your daughter will take place tomorrow morning. A special license. No banns, no guests, no wedding breakfast. We leave for Blackmoor by noon." "Tomorrow?" Edmund blanched. Panic briefly overrode his greed. "But her trousseau?" "The modiste requires weeks. A duke's bride cannot go to the altar in rags." "She will go to the altar in whatever she is wearing," Gareth said. "I am not buying a dress, Lord Holloway. I am buying a wife." "And the final condition," he straightened up, and the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, "you and your elder daughters are never to set foot in Blackmoor. The allowance is your pension. Consider it the price of my privacy. If you attempt to visit, or if you write asking for more money, the arrangement is void." Edmund blinked, the insult warring with the financial relief. The relief won easily. He nodded, his jowls shaking. "Draft the terms," Gareth said, gesturing to the paper. "My solicitor will finalize the contract tonight." Upstairs, the silence in the girl's bedchamber was venomous. Wren knelt on the uneven floorboards, folding a faded woolen shawl into a battered leather trunk. It was one of the few things she owned that hadn't originally belonged to Serafina or Isolde. Serafina paced the length of the room. Her silk slippers slapped hard against the wood. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. The red pinched marks on her cheeks had faded into a sickly white. "It is a punishment," Serafina said, her voice shaking with poorly suppressed rage. "He's mocking us. A man like that, a duke, choosing the scullery maid." "I am not a scullery maid, Serafina," Wren said quietly. She placed a pair of thick stockings into the trunk. "You might as well be." Serafina rounded on her, pointing a trembling finger. "Look at you. You have no grace. You have no conversation. You poured his tea. That is all you did. He chose you because you are nothing. You are a blank wall he won't have to look at." Wren didn't look up. Her hand smoothed the rough wool of the stockings. She knew Serafina was lashing out from the bleeding wound of her own ruined pride. But Wren also knew Serafina was right. "I know," Wren said. The simple agreement halted Serafina's tirade. She stared at her younger sister, breathing hard. "You know he does not want a wife to love, Serafina," Wren said, finally looking up. Her pale eyes were steady, reflecting the weak grey light from the window. "He wants a ghost to haunt his house. He chose me because I am already invisible. It is a terrible insult, but it is the truth." Isolde, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed staring blankly at the wall, let out a short, bitter laugh. "A ghost? You are going to be buried alive in the north, Wren. The man is a brute. Did you see his hands? He looks like he digs his own ditches." "He looks tired," Wren corrected mildly. "He will crush you," Serafina sneered, though some of the fire had gone out of her. She crossed her arms, suddenly looking very cold. "You will be a duchess in name, living in a tomb. You will have nothing." Wren looked back down at her trunk. She thought of the loud, suffocating panic of this house, the constant fear of debt, the relentless, competitive shrieking of her sisters vying for attention. She closed the lid of the trunk and fastened the brass buckles. They clicked sharply in the quiet room. "I will have quiet," Wren said. They were married at 10 o'clock the next morning in the village chapel. The priest smelled of stale gin and rushed through the liturgy as if he had a train to catch. Wren wore her Sunday dress, a dark navy wool too heavy for the muggy morning. Gareth wore a severe black coat. He did not smile. When he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was brief and clinical. His hand was warm, his calluses rough against her smooth knuckles. By noon, they were in the carriage. The vehicle was massive, sprung on heavy leather straps and pulled by 6 massive greys. The interior was upholstered in dark green velvet that smelled of beeswax and old dust. Wren sat on the forward-facing bench. Gareth sat opposite her as the carriage lurched forward, leaving the crumbling gates of Raythorn behind. Wren did not look back out the window. She kept her eyes fixed on the silver handle of the carriage door. They did not speak for the first 30 minutes. The rain from the previous days had ceased, but the roads were still deep, treacherous ruts of mud. The carriage swayed violently. Every jolt sent a shock up Wren's spine. She gripped the velvet seat, keeping herself upright, refusing to brace herself against the walls. Gareth watched her. He sat with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his long legs stretched out, taking up most of the floor space. His left leg, the ruined one, was extended rigidly. He observed his new wife with the same detached scrutiny he would use to inspect a new line of infantrymen. She was incredibly still. Most women of his acquaintance, his mother, his late brother's mistresses, would have filled the silence with nervous chatter. They would have complained about the jostling. They would have demanded to know when they were stopping for tea. Wren did none of these things. She sat perfectly straight, absorbing the brutal shocks of the road in silence. "You may lean back, madam," Gareth said. His deep voice startled her. It was the first time he had spoken since the altar. "The upholstery is not made of glass." Wren blinked, bringing her focus to his face. "I'm fine, Your Grace. We have 3 days of travel ahead of us. If you sit like a ramrod the entire way, your spine will snap before we reach the border." Wren slowly relaxed her shoulders, letting her back touch the plush velvet behind her. It was immensely comfortable. She let out a small, quiet breath. "Thank you," she said. The silence returned, but the sharpest edge had been blunted. By nightfall, the weather turned foul again. A biting wind swept across the countryside, driving rain against the carriage windows like handfuls of gravel. They stopped at a coaching inn near Lancaster. It was not a place dukes usually patronized. The yard was filled with the shouts of hostlers and the smell of wet horses and manure. Gareth stepped out first. He didn't offer his hand to help her down. He offered his entire forearm, holding it rigid as she stepped onto the muddy mounting block. The inn's private parlour was already taken by a travelling merchant. The innkeeper, a sweating man in a dirty apron, took one look at Gareth's cold eyes and the heavy purse in his hand and miraculously found a small, drafty back room beside the kitchen. Dinner was served on a scarred wooden table. It consisted of tough mutton, boiled potatoes that tasted of dirt, and a jug of weak, sour ale. Gareth cut into the grey meat. He was accustomed to terrible food. The army had fed him worse for years. He expected his new duchess, raised in an aspiring aristocratic house, to push the plate away in disgust. He waited for the tears. He waited for the inevitable breakdown. Wren picked up her knife and fork. She cut a small piece of the mutton, chewed it thoroughly, and swallowed. She took a sip of the ale, didn't grimace, and cut another piece of meat. Gareth paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Is it to your liking?" he asked, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. "It is entirely adequate," Wren said without looking up. "It is boot leather, madam." Wren set her fork down. She looked at him across the flickering light of the tallow candle between them. "I have eaten worse, your grace. When my father's gambling debts were particularly high last winter, the butcher stopped delivering. We ate potato soup for 3 weeks. This is fine." Gareth stared at her. The blunt, unapologetic honesty of the statement caught him off guard. There was no shame in her voice, no play for pity. It was just a fact. He slowly lowered his fork. "I see. Do not concern yourself with my comfort, your grace," Wren added, picking up her fork again. "I require very little. You will find I am a very cheap investment." The words were spoken softly, but they hit Gareth like a physical blow. A cheap investment. It was exactly what he had wanted. It was exactly what he had calculated. Hearing her say it out loud with such total lack of resentment made a strange, uncomfortable knot tighten in his chest. "Eat your dinner, Wren," he said gruffly. It was the first time he had used her given name. They finished the meal in silence. This time the silence was not entirely cold. The Cheviot Hills rose around them on the third afternoon, a jagged, unforgiving landscape of dark stone and deep, shadowed valleys. The green softness of the south vanished, replaced by wild heather and harsh winds. Wren pressed her face to the cold glass of the carriage window. She had never seen mountains. The sheer scale of the landscape made her breath catch. It was beautiful, but it was a violent, lonely beauty. "It is bleak," Gareth said, watching her face. "It is immense," Wren murmured. The carriage turned off the main road, passing between 2 massive, weather-beaten stone pillars topped with stone griffins. The iron gates were open, rusting on their hinges. They drove for another 2 miles through a dense, unkempt forest before the trees broke, revealing the estate. Blackmoor Hall was not a welcoming house. It was a sprawling, brutalist masterpiece of grey stone, built in a defensive square as if expecting a siege. The windows were narrow and tall, reflecting the grey sky like blind eyes. There were no manicured lawns, no blooming flower beds. The wild moor crept right up to the gravel drive. The carriage pulled to a halt before the massive oak front doors. There was no grand reception. A single footman hurried down the steps to open the carriage door. Gareth climbed out and turned to assist Wren. She stepped down, the wind immediately tearing at her cloak, whipping her hair across her face. She stood on the gravel, looking up at the towering facade. It looked like a prison. Or a fortress. "Welcome to Blackmoor," Gareth said quietly. They walked up the steps. The heavy doors were pulled open from the inside. The entry hall was cavernous. The floor was black and white checkered marble, dull from lack of polishing. Above them, a massive iron chandelier hung from a vaulted ceiling. The air inside was significantly colder than the air outside. It smelled of wood ash, old paper, and damp stone. Waiting at the base of the grand sweeping staircase was a woman in severe black bombazine. She was tall, gaunt, and held a ring of iron keys at her waist. "Mrs. Pruitt," Gareth said, pulling off his leather riding gloves. This is my wife, the new Duchess of Ravensmoor. Mrs. Pruitt did not smile. She offered a stiff, precise curtsy. Her eyes, pale and sharp as a hawk's, darted over Wren's travel-stained navy dress and plain wool cloak. The housekeeper clearly found the new Duchess lacking. "Your Grace," Mrs. Pruitt said, her voice echoing off the bare stone walls. "We were not expecting you so soon. The master suite is not prepared for a bride." "Prepare the East Wing suite for her Grace," Gareth ordered, throwing his gloves onto a silver tray on a nearby table. "I will remain in my current quarters." Wren felt a tiny, sharp prick of something in her chest. Not sorrow, just the final, undeniable confirmation of her reality. They were to live in separate wings of a massive, empty house. "As you wish," Mrs. Pruitt said smoothly, betraying no surprise. "Shall I arrange for tea in the drawing room?" "No. I have letters to write." "Send a tray to my study." Gareth turned to Wren. He looked massive in the dim light of the hall, his shoulders blocking out the meager light from the open door. "Mrs. Pruitt will show you to your rooms," he told her. "The house is yours to command. If you require anything, speak to her. We dine at 8. Do not be late." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing sharply on the marble floor, his left leg dragging slightly with fatigue. He disappeared down a dark, arched corridor. Wren was left standing in the freezing hall with a housekeeper who was looking at her like a stain on the rug. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Pruitt said, turning toward the stairs. They walked up 3 flights of stairs and down a corridor that seemed a mile long. Half the doors they passed were shut. The rooms behind them were dead and unused. The silence in the house was absolute. It pressed against the eardrums. Finally, Mrs. Pruitt unlocked a heavy door and pushed it open. "The East Wing suite," the housekeeper announced. Wren walked in. The room was massive. The walls were lined with dark oak paneling. A massive 4-poster bed stood in the center, hung with heavy, fading crimson velvet curtains. There was a sitting area by the tall windows, a vanity table, and a cold, empty fireplace. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the glass. It was freezing. "I will send a maid up to light the fire," Mrs. Pruitt said, lingering in the doorway, "and to unpack your belongings." "That will not be necessary," Wren said. Mrs. Pruitt frowned. "Not necessary, Your Grace? A duchess does not unpack her own bags." "I prefer to do it myself," Wren replied evenly. She turned to face the older woman. She knew what this was. The staff was testing her. They expected a weak, crying girl who had been sold to a monster. "As you wish," Mrs. Pruitt said. Her tone suggested she thought Wren was an idiot. "Will there be anything else?" "Yes." Wren walked over to the windows. They looked out over the back of the estate, miles of rolling dark heather stretching toward the horizon. "Send up a pot of tea. Loose leaf, not bagged. A kettle of boiling water, unmixed, and no sugar." Mrs. Pruitt blinked. "No sugar, Your Grace?" "None." "Thank you, Mrs. Pruitt. You are dismissed." The housekeeper stiffened, gave a jerky nod, and pulled the door shut behind her. Wren was alone. She stood in the middle of the massive, freezing room. She listened. There were no carriages rattling on cobblestones. There was no screeching laughter from Serafina. There was no frantic piano pounding from Isolde. There was no desperate pacing from her father. There was only the sound of the wind howling against the thick glass of the window. Wren slowly unclasped her heavy cloak and let it fall to the floor. She walked over to the massive 4-poster bed and ran her hand over the carved wooden post. It was solid, real. She walked to the window and looked out at the desolate, beautiful moors. Serafina had called this place a tomb. Isolde had said she would be buried alive. Wren rested her forehead against the cold glass, her lips curving up into a small, genuine smile. She had a room of her own. She had silence. She had an entire ocean of space and a husband who demanded absolutely nothing from her but her absence. For the first time in her 20 years of life, Wren felt like she could breathe. The first month at Blackmoor established a rhythm built on absence. Gareth left the house before dawn. He rode the borders of the estate, arguing with tenant farmers, inspecting collapsing stone walls, and driving his exhausted body until the phantom pains in his ruined thigh forced him to stop. He ate his meals in his study, a dark room smelling of leather and old dog, though the dog had been dead for 5 years. He saw his wife exactly once a week, on Sunday evenings, when they dined at opposite ends of a 30-foot mahogany table. They exchanged facts, the weather, the crop yield, the cost of coal. It was not a marriage. It was a status report. Wren did not mind. She spent her days unpicking the deep, rotting decay of the house. She did not play the Grand Duchess. When Mrs. Pruitt attempted to hand her the daily menus for approval, a stack of heavy, grease-stained cards detailing massive, expensive roasts, Wren handed them back. The Duke eats mutton and potatoes, Wren told the housekeeper, standing in the freezing kitchens. I eat whatever is cheapest. We are 2 people, Mrs. Pruitt, not a cavalry regiment. Sell the surplus stores in the village. Use the coin to buy lye soap and beeswax. This house smells like a crypt, and I want the floors scrubbed until they shine. Mrs. Pruitt bristled. The late Duchess never concerned herself with the scrubbing. The late Duchess is dead, Wren replied, her voice entirely flat, and I live here. Get the soap, Mrs. Pruitt. Wren stripped off her heavy wool outer skirts and tied a canvas apron around her waist. She did not order the maids to work. She knelt beside them on the freezing marble floors. She scrubbed the soot from the hearths. She inventoried the linen closets, finding moth-eaten ruin and salvaging what she could. She found a ledger of household expenses in the steward's office and spent 3 nights by the light of a single tallow candle tracking the bleed of money. She discovered that the butcher in the village was charging Blackmoor double the market rate. She discovered the coal merchant was delivering slate mixed with the anthracite. She fixed it not with shouting or threats, but with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a woman who had spent her life watching her father's wealth bleed away through negligence. She rode into the village in a plain cart, spoke to the merchants with terrifying, polite precision, and cut the estate's household expenses by 40% in 3 weeks. Mr. Hollis, the aging, perpetually sweating estate steward, brought the revised books to Gareth on a miserable Tuesday afternoon in November. Gareth sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples. The ledgers were usually a source of immense irritation to him. He hated the columns. He hated the numbers. He wanted to hit something, but he was a duke, and there was nothing to hit but paper. He looked down at the book Hollis placed before him. The handwriting in the margins was not Hollis's frantic scrawl. It was small, sharp, and perfectly legible. "What is this?" Gareth asked, tapping a column of corrected figures. "Her Grace, my lord," Hollis stammered, wiping his brow with a dirty handkerchief. She audited the pantry accounts and the coal deliveries and the laundry soap. She cut the butcher's bill in half. She threatened to buy a herd of pigs and slaughter them herself in the courtyard if he didn't adjust his prices to the regional standard, Your Grace. There was a note of genuine awe in the steward's voice. Gareth stared at the neat, merciless numbers. A strange, tight feeling gripped his chest. It was amusement, a deeply buried, rusty sensation. That evening, when he returned from a brutal ride through the freezing rain, he did not go straight to his study. He stopped in the main hall. The air smelled different. The damp rot was gone. It smelled of lemon oil, wood smoke, and clean linen. He walked up the stairs to the east wing. He had not set foot in this corridor since the day they arrived. He stood outside Wren's door. He could see a thin line of yellow light spilling from underneath the heavy oak. He didn't knock. He didn't want to intrude. He just stood there, listening to the absolute quiet of the house, and realized that for the first time in his life, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt anchored. The next afternoon, Wren walked into his study. Gareth was at his desk, surrounded by a chaotic mess of maps and unresolved boundary disputes. He looked up, startled. She was wearing a faded grey dress, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hands were red from cold water, and there was a smudge of ink on her chin. She carried a silver tray. On it was a single cup of tea, dark amber, no milk, no sugar. She didn't announce herself. She walked to the desk, shifted a map of the northern boundary just enough to make room, and set the cup down. The porcelain clicked softly against the wood. "You have been working for 6 hours," Wren said. Gareth looked at the tea, then at her. "There is a dispute over the grazing rights on the western ridge. The tenants are threatening to burn each other's barns." Wren looked at the map. She didn't feign ignorance, and she didn't apologize for looking. The western ridge is mostly shale. The grass is thin. They aren't fighting over grazing rights, Your Grace. They are fighting over the water access at the bottom of the incline. Gareth paused. He looked down at the map, tracing the blue line of the stream that cut through the valley. He had been looking at the property lines, the acreage. He had been thinking like a soldier holding a perimeter. He hadn't thought about the sheep. He looked back up at her. "How do you know that?" "Because sheep cannot drink rocks," Wren said simply. "Move the boundary line 50 yards east. Give them both access to the stream. The argument will end." She turned and walked out of the room, her boots clicking softly on the floorboards, leaving him alone with the map. Gareth picked up his pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and drew a new line 50 yards to the east. He picked up the teacup. It was still hot. It tasted perfect. From that day on, she brought the tea herself. She never stayed long. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. She would set the cup down, perhaps straighten a stack of chaotic papers with a quick, efficient movement of her hand, and leave. Sometimes he would ask her a question about the household ledgers and she would answer with brutal numeric honesty. It was a strange, functional intimacy. They were two gears in a massive broken machine finally beginning to catch and turn together. Winter in Northumberland did not announce itself. It broke down the door. In late January, a storm rolled off the hills, black and violent. By noon, the sky was the color of bruised iron. By 3 o'clock, the wind was screaming around the stone towers of Blackmoor Hall like a wounded animal. The snow fell so thick and fast that the stables, 50 yards away, vanished in a whiteout. Inside the house, the temperature plummeted. The massive stone walls, usually a defense, turned into an ice box. The heat from the fireplaces was sucked straight up the chimneys. Gareth was in his study, wearing his heaviest riding coat indoors, trying to read a letter from his solicitor. The wind rattled the heavy glass panes in their lead casing. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the house, followed by the terrifying sound of shattering glass and a roar of wind. Gareth dropped the letter. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and ran into the corridor. The cold hit him like a physical wall. The noise was coming from the long gallery on the second floor, a massive vaulted room lined with tall, fragile Elizabethan windows. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his bad leg screaming in protest, but the adrenaline drowned it out. He burst into the gallery. One of the massive 12-foot windows had blown inward. The wind was violently funneling into the room, bringing a horizontal blizzard with it. Snow was rapidly burying the Persian rugs and whipping against the family portraits. The pressure in the room was immense, threatening to blow out the rest of the glass. Gareth cursed violently. He needed canvas. He needed heavy oak boards from the cellar. He needed 3 footmen, but the servants' quarters were in the opposite wing, and the bell pulls were frozen solid. He stepped into the teeth of the wind, shielding his face with his arm, trying to reach the heavy velvet curtains to pull them across the breach, but the wind tore the fabric out of his hands, snapping it like a whip. "Leave the curtain," a voice shouted over the roar. Gareth whipped his head around. Wren was running down the gallery. She was dragging a massive, heavy canvas drop cloth, the kind used by painters to cover furniture. She had a coil of thick hemp rope slung over her shoulder and a hammer gripped in her right hand. She wore no coat, only a heavy woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her hair already whipping into a frantic halo around her face. "Wren, get out of here!" Gareth roared, stumbling back as a gust of wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The glass, she ignored him. She threw the heavy coil of rope at his chest. He caught it by reflex. The brass fixtures on the wall, Wren shouted, pointing to the heavy sconces mounted between the windows. "Tie off the corners. The canvas is too thick to nail into the stone." Gareth stared at her for a fraction of a second. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't screaming. She was organizing a defense. He moved. He grabbed the top corner of the canvas. It was stiff and freezing. The wind caught it like a ship's sail, nearly ripping it from his grip. His boot slipped on the snow-covered floorboards. Wren threw her entire body weight against the bottom of the canvas, pressing it toward the shattered window frame. "Pull, Gareth." It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it, screamed over the howl of the blizzard, sent a shock through his blood hotter than any fire. He planted his good leg, wrapped the rope around the brass sconce, and pulled with all the brutal, terrifying strength he possessed. The canvas stretched taut, covering the top half of the gaping hole. The wind shrieked, fighting them. Wren dropped to her knees in the accumulating snow, her fingers numb, frantically tying the bottom corners to the lower iron radiator grates, her knuckles scraped against the stone, leaving bright red smears of blood. She didn't stop. Gareth moved to help her. They worked shoulder to shoulder in the freezing vortex. He slammed his body against the canvas, holding it flush against the wall while she pulled the knots tight. He could feel the desperate, shivering heat of her through her thin dress. "Done!" Wren gasped, falling back onto her heels. The canvas snapped violently under the wind's pressure, but the ropes held. The horizontal blizzard stopped. The gallery was plunged into sudden, dim shadow. The immediate roar of the storm muffled to a heavy, threatening rumble. They sat in the snow on the floorboards, chests heaving, surrounded by shattered glass. Gareth looked at her. Wren was trembling violently. Her lips were blue. Blood dripped slowly from her raw knuckles, stark and bright against her pale skin. Her hair had pulled entirely free of its pins and lay plastered against her wet cheeks. She looked terrifying. She looked beautiful. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the logistics. He reached out and grabbed her. Gareth pulled Wren against his chest, wrapping his heavy, dry coat around her shivering body. She gasped at the sudden contact, stiffening for a second before the desperate need for warmth overrode her caution. She collapsed against him, burying her face in the wool of his lapel. "You little fool!" Gareth breathed, his voice raw, his chin resting on the top of her head. "You could have been ripped out the window." "You were losing your grip on the curtain," Wren murmured, her voice muffled against his chest. Her hands, freezing and bloody, gripped the fabric of his shirt. "You needed the canvas. I needed you to be safe." The words slipped out before he could catch them. They hung in the freezing air, heavier than the snow. Wren tilted her head back. She looked up at him. Her pale hazel eyes were wide, searching his face in the dim, storm-filtered light. The cynical, distant Duke was gone. The man holding her was terrified, exhausted, and desperately holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. He slowly lifted a hand, his rough thumb brushing a wet strand of hair from her cheek. He was careful. So incredibly careful, as if she were made of glass. "Your hands are bleeding," he said softly. "They will heal," she answered. Gareth didn't let her go. He stood up, taking her weight with him, ignoring the sharp spike of pain in his thigh. He kept his arm securely around her waist. "Come," he said. "The kitchen hearth is the only fire that will survive this draft." They didn't go to their separate wings. They walked down the stairs, leaning on each other. When they reached the kitchen, the servants were huddled in a terrified mass near the ovens. Seeing the Duke walk in, covered in snow, holding the Duchess tightly to his side, sent a shockwave of silence through the room. Gareth ignored them. He pulled a heavy wooden bench directly in front of the massive roasting fire. He sat Wren down, took a clean towel from a paralyzed scullery maid, and knelt in front of his wife. He took her hands. He didn't speak. He gently, meticulously wiped the blood and snow from her knuckles. The warmth of the fire baked into their wet clothes. The storm raged outside, burying the manor, cutting them off from the world entirely. Wren watched the top of his dark head as he cleaned her cuts. She watched the tension in his broad shoulders slowly unwind. For a man who wanted a ghost, he was holding her very tightly to the earth. The storm raged for 3 days, burying Blackmoor Hall under 4 feet of snow. The estate was an island. The silence that followed was total. It was not the cold, oppressive silence of a dead house. It was the heavy, muffled peace of a world wrapped in cotton. Gareth did not return to his study. The temperature in the main house remained brutally cold, so they confined themselves to a small oak-panelled sitting room on the ground floor, keeping a massive fire roaring in the hearth day and night. They shared the space. It was an awkward, delicate dance at first. Wren sat in a wingback chair reading a leather-bound history of the county. Gareth sat on the sofa trying to read a novel he had pulled randomly from the library. He spent more time looking over the top of the pages at her than he did reading. He watched the way she chewed her bottom lip when the text became dense. He watched the way she rested her bandaged hands carefully on her lap. He felt a constant, magnetic pull to bridge the 6 feet of carpet between them. On the evening of the 4th day, the wind finally died. The moon broke through the clouds, casting brilliant, stark white light across the snow-covered moors. Wren set her book down. She stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain to look out at the silver landscape. "It looks clean," she said quietly. Gareth closed his book. He stood up and walked over to her. He didn't stop a polite distance away. He stopped directly behind her. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating off his chest. "It does," he agreed. His voice was low, vibrating in the quiet room. He looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. "Wren." She didn't turn around, but she leaned back just a fraction of an inch. It was a microscopic surrender. "When I came to your father's house," Gareth said slowly, carefully choosing his words, "I told him I wanted peace. I thought peace meant isolation. I thought it meant emptiness." Hazel kept her eyes on the snow outside. "Now," Gareth said, his hands raised, hesitating for a second before resting on her shoulders. His grip was firm, grounding. He felt her take a slow, deep breath. But she didn't pull away. "I realize that an empty house is just a tomb. I didn't want a ghost, Wren. I was just too damaged to know how to ask for a partner. I was afraid of the noise. I was afraid of the demands. I thought any woman I brought here would look at me and see only the limp, the scars, and the isolation." Wren finally turned around. She was trapped between him and the window. But she didn't look frightened. She looked up into his grey eyes. The hardened, cynical armor he wore like a second skin was completely stripped away. He looked entirely vulnerable. "Serafina would have demanded London," Wren said plainly, her voice steady. "Isolde would have demanded brilliant conversation in society." "And what do you demand?" Gareth asked, searching her face. Wren reached up. She placed her small, bandaged hands flat against the lapels of his coat. She felt the heavy, steady thud of his heart beneath the wool. "I demand you drink your tea before it goes cold," she said. A startled, genuine laugh broke from Gareth's chest. It was a deep, rusty sound, startling in the quiet room. The tension in his jaw vanished. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a pragmatic solution to a dynastic problem, not as a quiet girl in a grey dress, but as the absolute center of his world. He slid his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The physical reality of him was overwhelming. Solid. Warm. Is that all? He murmured, leaning down, his face inches from hers. I also demand you stop working at 3 o'clock in the morning, Wren whispered, her breath catching as his hand moved up to cup her jaw. The ledgers will still be there at dawn. And I require you to let me fix the roof in the west wing. Done, Gareth said. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, polite kiss. It was desperate. It held months of silent observation, of repressed longing, of the absolute crashing realization that he had stumbled blindly into the greatest fortune of his life. Wren kissed him back with a fierce, answering heat. She looped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to him. She tasted like tea and survival. He tasted like smoke and safety. All the cold, calculating transactions that had brought them together burned away, leaving only this stark, undeniable truth. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily. Gareth rested his forehead against hers, keeping his arms tightly around her waist. He closed his eyes. Move your trunks, he said, his voice rough. Wren blinked. Move them where? Out of the east wing, Gareth replied. He opened his eyes, looking directly into hers. There was no hesitation, no retreat. The master suite is large enough for 2. I am entirely finished with living in a separate house from my wife. Wren felt a slow, brilliant warmth bloom in her chest. She smiled. It was a real smile, reaching all the way to her pale hazel eyes. Mrs. Pruitt will be scandalized, Wren noted. Mrs. Pruitt works for you, Gareth said, pressing a kiss to her temple. She will adapt, or she will pack. They stood by the window for a long time, watching the moonlight on the snow. The massive, drafty house around them was still silent. But the nature of the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the comfortable, deep quiet of a shared life. It was the peace of a door closing against the world, and knowing that exactly who you wanted was locked inside with you. When spring finally arrived in Northumberland, it came with a violent thaw. The snow melted into the streams, turning them into rushing torrents. The moors exploded into a sea of purple heather. Raythorn received its quarterly allowance on time, down to the final penny. Lord Edmund Halloway paid his gambling debts and immediately accrued new ones. Serafina married a minor baron who was 70 years old and entirely deaf, moving to a townhouse in London where she hosted loud, desperate parties. Isolde wrote scathing poetry about the tragic isolation of women and refused 3 respectable offers of marriage because the men did not read enough Greek. They never visited Blackmoor Hall. They considered Wren a tragic casualty, a girl sacrificed to a monster in the dark, cold north. They were entirely wrong. Wren stood on the terrace, watching the sun break over the distant hills. She wore a dress of deep, rich green velvet, a stark contrast to the faded greys of her past. She held a steaming cup of dark tea. Behind her, the heavy glass doors opened. Gareth stepped out onto the stone, his gait slightly uneven, holding a thick ledger. He looked tired, but the dark, bruised exhaustion under his eyes was permanently gone. He walked up behind her, sliding his free arm around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He kissed the side of her neck, breathing in the scent of starch and rain-soaked earth. The western boundary dispute is settled, he murmured against her skin. And Hollis says the new roof will be finished by August. Wren leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. She took a sip of her tea. It was bitter, strong, and perfectly hot. Good, she said quietly. Then we will have time to rebuild the glass house before winter. Gareth chuckled, a low rumble against her back. He took the teacup from her hand, took a sip himself, and handed it back. They stood together on the terrace, 2 quiet people looking out over their untamed, beautiful world, entirely content with the silence they had built together.